Welcome back. I say welcome back. It's more of just an initial welcome to Book Infested. This is a podcast where I talk about my reading ventures and things that interested me about different books that I've read, different literary things that come into my mind, and I guess just generally rants about literature and books and tropes and all that sort of thing. And apparently my vent is haunted because I just heard a noise coming out of it. It's appropriate. I just have a strange being living in my vent now, I guess. So first, I thought it would be appropriate to start this podcast with the first book that I've read of the year, that is 2025. And the first book that I read this year was Wormwood by Layla Martinez. I will say the book is a very solid 3.5 stars for me. And for people that maybe don't know my rating system or that I haven't explained this to before, I rate on the standard like 1 to 5 stars, largely because that's the way Goodreads rates things, and Goodreads is the reading app lord, I guess. So 5 stars. Genuinely, I think I've maybe given 1 or 2 books 5 stars in my entire life. Because to me, 5 stars is like the book was perfect. There's nothing I would have changed about it. It is absolutely perfect. 1 star is it was awful. I hated it. If I could give 0 stars, it would probably be 0 stars. 3 stars can either be like it's a soft 3 stars of like, it was okay. It gets 3 stars only because it wasn't bad enough to be less than 3 stars. Or it's a solid 3 stars of like, it was an enjoyable book. It wasn't anything fantastic, but it was good. I liked it. And I would probably recommend it to other people who maybe enjoy that genre a little bit more or enjoy certain elements of the story a little bit more than I do. It's still a very good read. It just wasn't anything that blew me out of the water. So those are, middle of the road and then the 2 ends of the spectrum. This book I would put as a very solid 3.5 stars. I really enjoyed it. It was a fun read. It wasn't anything that like blew me out of the water, but it was a very good read. It was very enjoyable. If you like haunted houses, stories about family trauma or generational trauma or like curses essentially handed down through families, if you like mysticism and any kind of haunting stories that revolve around religious iconography or anything like that, definitely this is a book that I would highly recommend. Generally speaking, again, just as a broad stroke summary of the book, it follows a granddaughter after she gets out of prison and returns home to a house that is haunted, and her grandmother, her grandmother supposedly can see saints, which is difficult to explain outside of the context of the book, but her grandmother can see saints, and as the story kind of progresses, they tell the alternating perspectives between the granddaughter and the grandmother. They tell the story of essentially what happened to the mother, so the generation between the grandmother and the granddaughter, how the house essentially came to be haunted. They explain a little bit of backstory around the grandmother being able to see the saints, and they also explain what happened to this little boy who right away at the beginning of the story you find out is missing. So I don't want to give away too much of the book at this point. I will explain more probably as the episode progresses, but just as it stands, that's the spoiler-free condensed version of what the story is. Again, highly recommended if you like haunted houses, especially like unconventional haunted houses, and I say that in the aspect of like the horror movie trope haunted house. So if you want something that's a little more of an unconventional haunted house, a book that deals with generational trauma, And again, a lot of that religious iconic figures and the whole saints and angels and all that kind of stuff. If you're interested in that, highly recommend this book. So one of the things that I can say about this that was interesting is that depending on your background, you may or may not believe that the grandmother is actually taken away by saints or if she's more or less possessed. It's an interesting story just in the sense of like normally there's this background. Well, let me say this. Clearly the background of the story is very much like heavily steeped in one part like folk religion and one part Catholicism. And it's a Spanish book, so it's translated from Spanish. And so I think that a lot of that cultural background may get lost in translation. I know that there were some things that I feel like I would have definitely understood more, or that I maybe would have maybe picked up on a little bit more if I knew more about Spanish history and Spanish folk religion and Spanish folklore. I'm not well versed in that, so there may be things that I missed, that I maybe wouldn't appreciate, that I maybe didn't appreciate reading it as much if I had known that background. So I will put that in as a bit of a disclaimer. But what I did really like about the book is that you're not really sure how reliable of a narrator either people are right from the get-go, because it starts from the granddaughter's perspective, and she tells you the story of like, oh, you know, I'm very poor and I'm trying to appear innocent, even though I've got all this hate inside of me towards the people of my village and towards the judges and all this kind of stuff and the people that I worked for. I hated them, but I didn't do anything to their son. You know, the boy just wandered off. But then the very next chapter, the grandmother is speaking and she's saying, don't believe that, you know, my granddaughter killed that boy. And so it's this back and forth of, well, who's really reliable? And as the story progresses and you hear more about the haunting of the house and how everybody feels about each other and things start to unfold about the town, you really start to question, are either of these narrators really reliable? Can you really believe anything that they're saying? And can you trust that they aren't just sharing in each other's, I guess, delusions when it comes to the hauntings and all that kind of thing? The grandmother talks a lot about how hate and rage and jealousy really plays a part in their daily lives and has really played a part in shaping them. And of course, you can draw the obvious conclusions of like the generational trauma really binds them together in the same way that they say in the house, like, anyone born into this house, anyone who comes into this house can never leave. And so you definitely can take a look at it. It's very clearly an allegory, in my opinion at least, for how generational trauma and how essentially the things that happen to our parents and our grandparents can still affect us, because in a lot of ways we definitely can feel like we can't escape from the metaphorical house that was built for us by sometimes 3 or 4 generations back. And it's very difficult to escape. And the granddaughter, even in the story, says multiple times, you know, like, oh, I was going to leave and go to college and I was going to get out of this place. And then in the end, she winds up in the same cycle that her grandmother has perpetuated. And it's very interesting in that it's obvious and you know that that's kind of what it's painting out, but you still enjoy being taken along on that ride. I'll enjoy, obviously, when it's a horror story, there's a certain level of, you know, enjoy, heavy quotations. But I do think that it speaks a lot to society and our own perceptions and a lot of aspects of classism as well. They talk a lot in the story of like the poor living in this village versus the two or three rich families that have essentially profited off of the backs of the poorer individuals in the town, and those who are stricken with poverty, and how the gap keeps getting bigger. And on both sides, this rage is just boiling in their stomach, and they hate each other, and how that essentially rots them from the inside out. They're effectively poisoned by their own loathing on each side. And I think that that's a really interesting and very poignant point to make. Something that was interesting about this story, and it actually wasn't the first time that I've encountered something like this, but was really fascinating to me, was the way people approached the haunted house and how they view it. And I don't know if it's simply because of my own background as an American person who has mostly watched, haunted house films, or, heard stories of haunted houses when I was growing up. And so kind of has the American idea of a haunted house in the back of my head. So I don't know how common this idea is to different cultures when it comes to haunted houses. But the family in this story, the grandmother and the granddaughter, approached the haunting of the house very just like straightforward. The granddaughter is explaining right away, almost in a blasé sort of manner of like, oh, the house reacts to the way you feel. The house, it talks about like how the house will hold still like it's holding its breath, how the walls will like expand as if gorged on something, how there are shadows everywhere, how she has to be careful about, things that will reach out from under the bed, things that will come out of the wardrobe. And it's very straightforward and very like aware of the house being haunted. And it actually reminded me of a book that I read a couple of years ago, and I had to look it up. It is called Finches by A.M. Muffaz, Muffaz. And in that story as well, it covers a house that is haunted by a grandfather, and everyone is like a grandfather and his wife, his dead wife, obviously. And everyone is very aware of the fact that the house is haunted, and just kind of approaches it in a straightforward manner of like, yep, this is how it is. This is how life is now in this house. And so again, with Wormwood, where it's going in and it's like the house is very much alive. The house is essentially an entity unto itself and is very much alive, and there are all of these spirits that are trapped in it. Not to mention the fact that there are insect-like angels, which again, I don't know how much of that is to be believed, like if they're actually seeing angels or if they're just seeing other entities. And then, of course, the grandmother keeps being, in the words of the books, taken up by the saints, or the saints will take her. It's very interesting how the story just approaches this idea of like, the house is haunted, everyone is aware that it's haunted, and everyone just accepts that as fact. They don't try to change it, they don't try to overcome it. It simply is what it is. And for me, that was fascinating, to encounter it for a second time in this book. And I think largely because, at least from an American perspective, there's always this idea of like, the house is haunted because, one specific person died here, or the house is haunted because, a la Poltergeist, it was built over some sort of Native American burial ground, or it's on some sacred land, and you have to either burn it to the ground, or you have to exorcise it, or you have to do something to like make it not haunted anymore. So to come into a story where it's like, no, the house is haunted, and it's also a metaphor for something, which, I mean, to be fair, a haunted house is always a metaphor for something in literature, especially Gothic literature. But the house is haunted. It's haunted for a reason, but that's just the way that it is, and in fact, we're not going to try and change it, is such a fascinating look for me personally, but I also think speaks into the culture of the characters in the story and speaks into this idea of generational trauma. The very thought, especially in this book, of each generation has said, like, oh, I'm gonna leave. Well, not each generation. So the great grandfather built the house, and then the grandmother who lives there now with the granddaughter. The grandmother never, if I recall correctly, never said anything about, like, oh, I was gonna get out of here. But both the mother and the granddaughter have said that they wanted to get out of here and they wanted to do something else, and they both wound up trapped in this cycle that was perpetuated, initiating with the grandfather, but was perpetuated then, or excuse me, by the great grandfather, and then was perpetuated by the great grandmother, and then the grandmother, and then eventually this granddaughter gets looped into it as well. They get caught up in this, and to me, that's with the fact that the house is haunted, and not only they're not trying to change it, but they're almost feeding into it. It definitely speaks to that idea of feeding into the cycle that will ultimately harm you in the end. And I obviously don't want to read too much into the author's intentions, but that's how it spoke to me. And I would say that that's a very powerful way to look at a haunting story and to look at a story about a home being possessed. I mean, when you think about it, like, a home is meant to be a sanctuary. A home is meant to be the place where you feel safest. And to not only have a home that is not safe, but that you actively have to be aware of, and yet you can't leave, and it has to be fed, for lack of a better term, to keep content. I mean, there are a lot of things that can speak into that. I did really enjoy the way that the author showed everybody coming, because there's a line that said, everyone that comes into this house can't leave. And I'm paraphrasing, but that's effectively what the line is. And it's very interesting to, like, draw how the author chose to draw that dynamic in the story, because it starts with the great grandfather who built the house off of essentially subjugating women. I mean, he ran what was effectively a small brothel out of a farmhouse, and with his earnings built his own home, and married the great grandmother, who then committed murder by murdering the father. But there's some contention over whether or not the shadows started with the great grandmother before or after the great grandfather was murdered. And so it's like, were the shadows part of the trauma, or are the shadows actual hauntings? And I think that as well, let me say, first of all, so anyone who comes into the house can't leave. So now the great grandmother is trapped. She spends the rest of her life as a widow. She would never remarry, even though it was made pretty clear in the story that she could have remarried if she wanted. She could have married a better man. She could have moved out. Or I should say, the opportunity to do so was there, and she chose to stay for whatever her reasons were. The grandmother then gets married out of wedlock, and then brings a man into the house, and the man literally withers away. And the way it's described in the story is effectively that the house sucked his life dry. He withered up in this home. And it's interesting then, because we don't get to see the great grandmother. We don't get to see firsthand the origin of the house and how the shadows came to be and how it came to be haunted. It is really an interesting look at, okay, now that we've established that both the grandmother and the granddaughter are unreliable narrators, how much of the house being haunted is real and how much of it is their own, essentially their own trauma warping their perception. How much of this is an actual ghost story, more or less, and how much of this is them sharing in essentially a metaphorical delusion. And maybe I'm reading too much into it. I probably am, because that's what I do. But to me, that was just very fascinating and a very interesting look. And it's an interesting thought to kind of spin off of, with a story that really deals with so much. And it's not a long read. The book itself is actually quite short. I don't have it sitting next to me right now, so I don't know exactly how many pages, but I think it was only like 150 or 160 pages. And so it was a relatively quick read for something that packed so much into it. I mean, you have elements of the classism, and how that affects not just people on a personal level, but as a community. I mean, the story talks a lot about the community in general, and how everything affects everyone in the village. Both the granddaughter and the grandmother talk about the people in the village, almost as if they're all a part of a single entity. It's almost like everyone who lives in the village is a part of this emotional petri dish. And it is really interesting and really fascinating. So you're talking about the different classes kind of fighting for their place and having this disdain for each other, and how that affects the village as a whole. And I guess kind of in the sidelines a little bit, how it affects the country on a wider spectrum, but then also how it affects them individually. And so that's really interesting. You have this element of, the discussions of how one man's desire to kind of gain power by subjugating those who he believes are beneath him, which again tie into that class thing, but also just on a personal, a man who is an abusive level, how that ties into the generational trauma. So you have one man who essentially sets into motion, 4 generations of people who then are suffering the consequences of his decisions. And that speaks a lot. Again, I keep saying generational trauma, and you're going to get sick of me saying it, but it really speaks to how trauma and abuse affect not just directly the person who is being abused, but down the line how that affects things. And so I think on a deeper level it really speaks to that as well. And of course, if you want to read it just on a more surface level, if you don't want to read into it the way that I've read into it, on a surface level, it's just a kind of cool take on a spooky haunted house story that also has a murder woven into it. So the book deals with a lot. The class, the generational trauma. It deals with how poverty affects things. And it deals a lot with as well, this is kind of the undercurrent for a lot of the story, of how rage and spite and in a lot of ways unforgiveness can eat away at you. And I say unforgiveness in the sense of, like, I think a lot of people mistake the term of forgiveness to mean saying everything that the person you're forgiving did is okay, and that's not what I mean. Forgiveness in a truly, like, dictionary definition is simply not hanging on to anger for what happened to you. So basically saying I'm choosing not to be angry about what this person did to me. And anger is something that is the thread through the whole story. You know, the grandmother is angry, or excuse me, the great grandmother is angry at the grandmother because the grandmother can see the saints and the great grandmother couldn't. The great grandmother is also angry at the great grandfather for what he did to her. The grandmother is angry at her daughter, the mother, for running away and for, you know, not doing what she said. The mother was angry at the grandmother for everything. They seem to just fight all the time, you know, and the grandmother even said that they would just hurl abuse at each other and argue all the time. And now the granddaughter has this anger in the pit of her stomach at everything that's come down the line that has stuck her where she is now. The villagers are angry at the rich folk in the town. The rich folk in the town are angry at the villagers, are angry at everybody. Politics and everything. Like, this thread of anger through the whole story that just eats away at you like a woodworm, ergo the name of the story, that just infects everything about them, is kind of the ultimate death in the story, even outside of the murders that happened and the death that occurred in the house. These people are incapable, the people in the story are incapable of living outside of the anger that has poisoned them. And that, it's almost like, and that's worse than the house being haunted. You can't escape the house, not because the house is haunted, but because you can't let go of the anger you have from everything else. And it does make me wonder if, you know, the grandmother and the granddaughter were able to let go of some of that anger and were able to heal from some of that, if they would be able to leave the house, or if the house would stop being haunted. It's an interesting idea, at least, an interesting thought to me. Again, I would give this story a solid 3.5 stars. I really liked I liked this idea of the house being haunted and the people who live in it just kind of accepting that and having that be a part of their daily life. Again, very similar to Finch's, which is another book that is interesting and I would recommend. I would have to read it again to remember my exact rating on it for Finch's, but it's definitely in the same vein as that if you've read that before. Highly recommend the story to people who like folk tales, folk religion, Catholicism and Catholic imagery, religious imagery, kind of unique takes on views on spiritualism, at least, again, from my perspective. I would also recommend the story to people who like haunted house tales. It is very much, you get that spooky haunted house feeling from it, so would highly recommend. Recommend to just a general kind of, I don't want to call it an easy read, but it is genuinely just like an enjoyable, easy read to get through. So in that sense, would recommend it for that. If you have other recommendations for stories similar to this, feel free to drop them to me. I am on Instagram under Salem's Study. I am also on Blue Sky under the same username. So those are going to be the best two ways to get in touch with me if you want to send any recommendations or anything like that. You can also email me at salemsstudy@gmail.com if you want to send any recommendations to me as well. I very much look forward to any kind of feedback that people have, anything that you would like me to read, or elements that you want me to touch on. I have more book reviews, but also more thoughts in the future on different story ideas and different, I guess, more literary analysis on more general themes, not just specifically book reviews, but I do have an episode that I am working on right now about vampirism and its relation to addiction and abuse and all that kind of thing. And actually, believe it or not, I started working on it before I saw Nosferatu, the newest one, though it definitely plays into that. I have stories about the development of classic Gothic monsters, quote unquote, and how they've kind of developed over the years, and how they've kind of become what they are now. So if you want to hear about that and also want to hear book reviews of further stories in the future, please stay tuned, and keep an eye out for future episodes. Thank you so much for listening, and happy hauntings. Thank you so much for listening to this episode. As you might have noticed, I kept referring to the book as Wormwood by Layla Martinez. This is an error. For whatever reason, I kept thinking of the word wormwood. The book is actually called Woodworm by Layla Martinez. It is a Spanish to English translation, so it initially published in Spanish, and I highly recommend getting it from whatever your local bookseller is, or from your local library. Again, I'm not sure why I kept calling it Wormwood, but the book is actually called Woodworm by Layla Martinez. Thank you so much for listening, and please forgive me. I apparently don't know how to do my own job.